The slap echoed louder than the music. In a room filled with investors' family and quiet judgment, Joshua Caldwell struck his wife across the face. Because she had failed, he said to give him a child. No one moved. Naomi Caldwell didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She didn't even raise a hand to her cheek. Across the room, two investors exchanged a look, brief, unreadable, but knowing. Joshua believed he owned everything in that room. He didn't know the deal that built it. Wasn't his. If you believe dignity speaks louder than noise, stay with this story. Before we go on, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every comment. And if stories about quiet strength and real justice matter to you, consider subscribing. Naomi Caldwell had always understood the value of silence, not as submission, but as distance. Distance gave clarity. It allowed her to observe without interference, to remember without distortion, and to act without hesitation when the time came. It was a discipline she had learned long before she met Joshua Caldwell, long before his name became something people said with admiration in boardrooms and with envy in private conversations. She was born Naomi Langford, the only daughter of Victor Langford, a man whose name rarely appeared in headlines, yet whose influence shaped the outcomes behind them. His firm did not advertise. It did not need to. It moved quietly through acquisitions, restructurings, and financial recoveries that other institutions avoided. They were not interested in visibility. They were interested in control. Naomi grew up in that atmosphere where numbers mattered more than narratives, and where decisions were made in calm voices, never in raised ones. She attended Columbia University, studying finance and law in parallel, not because she needed both degrees, but because she understood early that power lived in the intersection between them. Those who controlled money without understanding the law were exposed. Those who knew the law without controlling capital were limited. Naomi chose not to be either. By the time she graduated, she had already reviewed more real contracts than most junior associates would see in their first 3 years. Her father never praised her directly. He simply gave her more responsibility. That was how approval worked in the Langford household. When Naomi first met Joshua Caldwell, it was at a private investment conference in San Francisco. He was not yet the man he would become, but he was close enough to it to be noticeable. Joshua spoke with conviction. Not the loud, performative kind, but the kind that drew attention because it seemed earned. He had built his logistics startup from nothing, at least. That was the story people repeated. And like all effective stories, it was both true and incomplete. Naomi noticed the gaps before she noticed the charm. She listened as he explained his expansion strategy, ambitious but fragile in places he did not yet see. His projections assumed stability in variables that were anything but stable. His capital structure was aggressive, leaning on future growth to justify present risk. But he believed in it, completely. That belief was what made him compelling. They spoke briefly after his presentation. Joshua was surprised that she asked about downside protection instead of upside potential. Most people were eager to hear how big something could become. Naomi was more interested in how it would survive if it didn't. He didn't have a full answer, but he didn't deflect either. "I'll figure that part out," he said. It wasn't confidence, not exactly. It was something quieter, a willingness to admit the unknown without stepping away from it. Naomi remembered that. Their relationship did not begin with romance. It began with conversations structured, deliberate, often circling around risk leverage and timing. Joshua found in Naomi something he hadn't encountered before, someone who didn't need to impress him and therefore never tried. And Naomi found in Joshua something she recognized from her father's early years' momentum without insulation. He was moving fast, but he had no system beneath him that could absorb failure. That was where she began to step in. Not visibly, not publicly. At first, it was small suggestions. A restructuring of a loan agreement, a different sequencing of capital raises, a quiet introduction to a contact who could stabilize a weak link in his supply chain. Joshua accepted her input easily in those early months. He saw it as support valuable but secondary to his own direction. And Naomi allowed that perception to exist. Their marriage followed in a way that made sense to both of them, even if it did not resemble the kind of love people described in simple terms. There was respect. There was alignment of goals. There was, at least in the beginning, a shared understanding that they were building something together. But the definition of together began to change. As Joshua's company grew, so did the attention around him. Articles began to appear. Panels invited him to speak. Investors who once hesitated now competed for access. Visibility has a way of reshaping memory. What had once been collaborative began to feel to him like individual achievement. Not consciously at first. It was subtle, small omissions when recounting how decisions were made. Slight shifts in language. I decided replacing we discussed. Naomi noticed. She did not correct him. Correction, in her experience, was rarely effective in moments of ascent. People did not revise their narratives while they were still being rewarded for them. So she continued to work the same way she always had, quietly, precisely, without seeking acknowledgement. Behind the scenes, her involvement deepened. She reviewed contracts before Joshua signed them often, without him realizing the extent of her revisions. She anticipated risks in partnerships he believed were straightforward. She redirected negotiations by introducing terms that seemed minor, but would later become critical safeguards. Joshua trusted her judgment, but he no longer examined it. Trust, when combined with success, can become a kind of blindness. At home, the shift was more personal. Joshua began to carry his public persona into private spaces. Conversations became shorter. His attention fragmented between calls, messages, and the constant pull of expansion. Naomi adapted as she always did, adjusting her expectations, rather than confronting the change directly. It was around this time that the subject of children entered the conversation, not as a mutual desire, but as an expectation introduced by Joshua's family. Margaret Caldwell. His mother believed in legacy in its most traditional form. To her, success without continuation was incomplete, and continuation in her mind had a very specific definition. The first time she asked Naomi about it, the question was framed politely. The second time, less so. By the third, it had become a recurring topic raised in dinners, in passing comments and comparisons to other families. Joshua did not intervene, not because he agreed necessarily, but because he did not prioritize stopping it. That too, Naomi noticed. She scheduled a medical evaluation on her own. It was not a decision driven by pressure, but by a preference for certainty. Speculation in her world was inefficient. The results were clear. There was nothing preventing her from having a child. The doctor explained it in clinical terms with the kind of neutrality that came from repeating the same conclusions to many patients. Naomi listened, asked precise questions, and requested full documentation. She did not share the results immediately. Instead, she asked Joshua gently, without accusation, if he would consider being evaluated as well. He declined. Not firmly, not aggressively, just enough to make it clear he did not see the necessity. "I'm fine," he said. "It's probably just timing." Timing. Naomi did not press further. She had already learned something more important than the medical conclusion itself. Joshua preferred assumptions that protected his sense of control over facts that might challenge it. And so the narrative settled unspoken, but reinforced by repetition, that the absence of a child was a reflection of Naomi. Margaret leaned into it. Elise echoed it with sharper edges. Joshua allowed it to stand. Naomi did not argue. She recorded, not in a literal sense, not yet, but in memory, in pattern, in the accumulation of moments that individually could be dismissed, but collectively formed something undeniable. She understood, perhaps earlier than Joshua did, that their marriage was no longer balanced. Not in effort, not in perception, and not eventually in power. But imbalance, like most things in Naomi's world, was not something to react to immediately. It was something to wait through. Because timing, when chosen correctly, could turn quiet knowledge into irreversible consequence. And Naomi had always been patient. By the time the $900 million deal entered its final phase, Joshua Caldwell believed he was standing at the edge of something inevitable. He had repeated the narrative enough times to investors, to the press, to himself, that it no longer felt like a projection. It felt like fact. The acquisition would position his company, Caldwell Logistics, as a dominant force in cross-border infrastructure. It would give him access to distribution corridors competitors had spent decades trying to secure. It would, in the language he preferred, change the scale of the game. What Joshua did not fully understand was that the scale had already changed. He just hadn't noticed who changed it. The deal as it appeared on paper was structured as a multi-layered investment agreement between Caldwell Logistics and a consortium of private equity firms. At the center of that consortium was Bennett Capital, led by Laura Bennett, a woman known not for her visibility, but for her precision. Laura did not fund potential. She funded certainty disguised as potential. When Joshua first pitched the expansion, she had listened without interruption, her expression neutral, her questions minimal. It was not approval. It was assessment. The numbers were promising. The projections were aggressive, but not unrealistic. The opportunity existed. The protection did not. Joshua's proposal lacked a stabilizing layer, a financial guarantee that could absorb volatility without collapsing the entire structure. Without that, the deal was not just risky. It was exposed. Laura had not rejected him outright. She had done something more deliberate. She had paused, come back when the foundation matches the ambition, she said. Joshua interpreted that as a challenge. Naomi recognized it as a boundary. It was shortly after that meeting that Naomi began to move more actively. She did not inform Joshua of her intentions, not because she wanted to deceive him, but because she understood that explanation would introduce resistance. Joshua was still operating within a framework where control had to appear singular. Any indication that the foundation of his largest deal depended on someone else would have unsettled him. And instability, even emotional, could ripple outward. So Naomi worked within a different structure, one that did not require acknowledgement to function. She reached out to a contact she had not spoken to in nearly a year, Daniel Reeves. Daniel operated in a space adjacent to her father's network, specializing in complex financial instruments that existed just beyond the comfort zone of traditional institutions. He was careful, discreet, and most importantly, he understood layered transactions without needing them simplified. Their conversation was brief. "I need insulation," Naomi said. "For how much?" Daniel asked. She gave him a number. There was a pause, not of hesitation, but of recalibration. "That's not insulation," he replied. "That's control." Naomi did not correct him. Through Daniel, Naomi established the first layer, a series of intermediary entities that would function as both buffer and bridge. None of them carried her name. None of them connected directly to Langford Holdings. On the surface, they appeared independent minor players pooling capital into a larger opportunity. In reality, they were aligned with a single source. From there, Naomi initiated contact with Laura Bennett, not as Joshua's wife, and not under her own name. She used a legal representative, Andrew Collins. Andrew had worked with the Langford network for years. He understood not only how to structure deals, but how to construct distance between origin and execution. When he approached Bennett Capital, he did so with documentation that reframed the entire risk profile of Joshua's proposal. The conversation that followed was not about potential. It was about protection. Laura reviewed the materials over the course of 2 days. She traced the financial pathways, examined the guarantees, and evaluated the contingency structures embedded within the proposal. At no point did she ask who stood behind them. She didn't need to. She recognized the pattern. On the 3rd day, she approved conditional participation. The deal moved forward. Joshua received the confirmation as validation of his persistence. He attributed the shift to his revised pitch, to his insistence, to the clarity of his vision. He did not question the timing. Naomi did not explain it. From that point on, The deal accelerated. Legal teams exchanged drafts. Financial models were adjusted. Press narratives were prepared in anticipation of the announcement. Joshua became increasingly occupied, his schedule tightening as meetings stacked back-to-back across time zones. Naomi remained present, but in a way that blended into the background of his momentum. She reviewed documents late at night, often after Joshua had already fallen asleep or returned to his office for another call. She corrected clauses that could later be exploited. She adjusted language that appeared neutral but carried long-term implications. She never signed anything. Her influence existed in revisions, not in recognition. Andrew Collins maintained the external structure. He coordinated filings, ensured compliance across jurisdictions, and managed the legal distance between Naomi and the visible framework of the deal. At one point, he raised a question. "You're building a position with full exposure and no acknowledgement," he said during one of their calls. "If something goes wrong, you absorb the impact without being able to claim the authority." Naomi considered that. "Yes," she said. "And if it goes right?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately, because the outcome to her was not measured in the success of the deal itself. It was measured in when and how that success could be understood. Meanwhile, Joshua's behavior continued to shift in ways that were subtle enough to ignore, but consistent enough to matter. He stopped asking for Naomi's input directly. Not because he rejected it, but because he assumed it would be there regardless. His decisions became faster, less examined, driven by the confidence that had been reinforced by recent successes. In meetings, he began to speak in absolutes. This will close. This will scale. This is secured. The last statement in particular carried a certainty that did not belong to him. Naomi heard it once during a call he took from their living room. She was seated across from him, reviewing a set of financial summaries. He didn't look at her when he said it, but she looked at him, not with resentment, with recognition. Because that was the moment the separation between perception and reality became complete. Joshua believed the deal was secured because he had willed it into stability. Naomi knew it was secured because she had built the structure that held it together. The difference between those two beliefs was not immediate. It did not create conflict in that moment. It simply existed quietly, like a fault line, beneath a surface that still appeared intact. As the final agreements approached signature, Andrew sent Naomi a complete dossier of the deal structure. Every transfer, every entity, every guarantee. It was not a summary. It was a map. "This is everything," he wrote. Naomi opened the file and reviewed it slowly, not because she needed to understand it, she already did, but because she understood the importance of seeing it in its entirety. The scope of her involvement, the extent of her control, the invisibility of both. She closed the file without comment. Across the city, Joshua was preparing for the announcement that would define the next phase of his career. He rehearsed statements, coordinated media timing, and finalized the guest list for the celebration that would follow. He was in every visible way at the center of his own success. And Naomi allowed that image to remain undisturbed, because correction, when done too early, diminished its own impact. And Naomi had never been interested in partial truths. She waited for alignment, for timing, for the moment when what was hidden would no longer need to be revealed, only presented. The Caldwell home in Palo Alto was designed to impress without appearing intentional. Glass walls opened toward a controlled landscape of trimmed hedges and quiet water features. The interior favored neutral tones, stone oak soft gray meant to suggest stability rather than excess. It was the kind of house that communicated success in a language older than trends. Margaret Caldwell approved of it, not because she admired the design, but because it reflected what she believed her son had become. What she did not approve of was Naomi. Her disapproval was never introduced directly. It arrived gradually layered beneath polite questions and carefully phrased observations that left little room for response. At first, she had framed it as concern. "You must be very busy, Naomi," she had said during one of the early family dinners, balancing everything. Naomi understood the implication. Balance in Margaret's vocabulary referred to a hierarchy, one in which career was acceptable, but only if it did not interfere with what she considered a wife's primary function. Naomi responded simply. I manage my schedule carefully. Margaret smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. As months passed, the questions became more pointed. Have you thought about children? Is there a reason you're waiting? Time isn't something we get back. The tone remained controlled, but the repetition gave it weight. It was no longer curiosity, it was expectation. Elise Caldwell, Joshua's younger sister, approached the subject differently. Where Margaret relied on restraint, Elise preferred precision. She chose moments when the conversation could not easily shift mid-meal between courses, when attention was naturally focused. It's interesting, Elise remarked once, swirling her wine as she spoke. Most couples at your stage have already started a family, especially when things are going well. Her eyes rested briefly on Naomi, then moved away, as if the comment had no specific target. Naomi did not respond. She never responded to Elise directly. There was no advantage in engaging someone who treated conversation as a form of sport. Joshua sat at the head of the table during these dinners, often distracted, checking messages, responding to emails, his attention divided between the present and whatever required his immediate input elsewhere. He heard the comments. Naomi knew he did, but he rarely intervened. Not because he agreed with his mother or sister entirely, but because he did not see the necessity of correcting them. In his mind, these were minor discomforts, temporary, peripheral to the larger trajectory of his life. And Naomi, he assumed, was capable of handling them. She was, but not in the way he imagined. Naomi did not defend herself. She observed patterns, the consistency of the remarks, the way they escalated when left unchallenged, the absence of resistance from Joshua, the subtle reinforcement that came from silence. It formed a structure one as clear to her as any financial model. Eventually, she chose to replace speculation with certainty. The medical appointment was scheduled without discussion. Naomi preferred information before conversation, conclusions before confrontation. The clinic was discreet, the staff efficient, the process clinical in its detachment. She answered questions, provided samples, and waited. The results arrived sooner than expected. There was no ambiguity. Her health was not a limiting factor. The doctor explained it in measured terms, outlining possibilities, timelines, and next steps. Naomi listened, asked for documentation, and clarified the statistical margins involved. There was no emotional response. Not because the information lacked significance, but because it aligned with what she had already suspected. What mattered was not the result itself. It was what the result displaced. When she returned home, Joshua was in his office, engaged in a call that appeared urgent from the tone of his voice. Naomi did not interrupt. She placed the folder on her desk and continued with her work. That evening, she introduced the subject gently. I had a medical evaluation done. She said, her tone neutral. Joshua looked up briefly. Everything okay? Yes, Naomi replied. There are no issues on my side. He nodded, the information registering but not anchoring. That's good, he said, returning his attention to his tablet. Naomi waited a moment before continuing. It might be useful for you to be evaluated as well, just for clarity. Joshua's response was immediate but not defensive. I don't think that's necessary, he said. It's probably just timing. We've both been busy. Timing. The word settled into the space between them, familiar now in its usage. Naomi did not challenge it. She had not expected agreement. What she had sought was confirmation. Joshua preferred explanations that required no adjustment from him. That preference would not change through discussion. So she allowed the moment to pass. In the weeks that followed, the narrative within the Caldwell family remained unchanged, only now Naomi understood it fully. Margaret's comments became less subtle. You should consider seeing someone, she suggested one afternoon, her voice carrying a softness that implied concern but delivered judgment. There are excellent specialists. Elise, seated nearby, added with a faint smile, assuming the issue can be addressed. Naomi acknowledged neither statement. She had already moved beyond them. What they were discussing was no longer a question. It was a misconception, one that persisted only because it had not yet been corrected. Joshua continued to operate within that same assumption. Occasionally, he would reference their situation in passing, framing it as something that would resolve itself once circumstances allowed. "After this deal closes," he said once, almost casually, "we'll have more time to focus on things like that. Things like that." Naomi noted the phrasing. Children in his mind had become another milestone aligned with success scheduled alongside expansion. Not a shared decision, an extension of achievement. She did not argue, because the issue was no longer about belief. It was about evidence. And evidence, when introduced at the right moment, did not require persuasion. It required acknowledgement. Naomi stored the medical report alongside other documents she had begun to organize more deliberately, not because she intended to use it immediately, but because she understood its relevance within a broader context. Truth in isolation could be dismissed. Truth, when aligned with pattern, became undeniable. The comments continued. The assumptions remained. The imbalance deepened not in visibility, but in foundation. Joshua moved forward unaware that the structure beneath him was no longer what he believed it to be. And Naomi remained still, not passive, not unaware, simply waiting. Because in her world, timing was not a matter of chance. It was a decision. By the time the celebration was scheduled, the deal had already been finalized in every way that mattered. The signatures were in place. The capital had moved. The legal structures complex, layered intentionally opaque, had been sealed into a form that appeared seamless from the outside. To Joshua Caldwell, it was the culmination of years of effort, risk, and persistence. To Naomi, it was something else entirely. It was complete. And completion in her world was not the end of a process. It was the point at which consequences became inevitable. The event itself was Joshua's idea. Not a quiet dinner, not a limited gathering of close associates, but a carefully orchestrated evening designed to reflect scale. The guest list extended beyond family and immediate partners. It included key investors, strategic allies, and a selection of individuals whose presence would reinforce the perception of Joshua's ascent. Visibility mattered to him now, in ways it hadn't before. "People need to see it," he said, reviewing the event layout with one of his assistants. "Not just hear about it." The venue was their Beverly Hills property, chosen not for convenience, but for impact. The house would serve as both setting and statement. Every detail was considered: lighting, catering, guest flow, even the timing of Joshua's remarks. Naomi observed the preparations without interfering. She understood the function of the evening. It was not merely a celebration. It was a consolidation of narrative, an opportunity to align perception with outcome. Joshua wanted to be seen as the architect of something undeniable. Naomi allowed that intention to move forward uninterrupted. In the days leading up to the event, her own work continued, but with a different focus. Andrew Collins had sent over the final compilation of documents related to the deal's structure. Not summaries, not excerpts, but the full architecture ownership chains, capital flows, conditional clauses, and the embedded rights that had been quietly secured within them. It was the kind of file that did not reveal its significance at a glance. But to Naomi, it was precise. Every element was where it needed to be. Every safeguard accounted for. Every connection traceable if one knew where to look. Andrew's message accompanying the file was brief. "Everything is documented, fully enforceable, when you're ready." Naomi read the message once, then again. There was no urgency in his words, no suggestion of action, only readiness. She downloaded the file, encrypted it, and stored it in a location separate from her primary systems. Redundancy was not a habit. It was a requirement. Then she created a second version organized differently. Not by structure, but by clarity. She separated the most critical elements, the guarantees tied to Langford-controlled entities, the pathways of capital that led back indirectly but definitively to her. and the clauses that allowed intervention under specific conditions. It was not enough for the truth to exist. It had to be understood. Across the house, preparations continued. Staff moved efficiently through rooms, adjusting placements, testing lighting, confirming arrangements. The atmosphere was controlled, professional, and quietly anticipatory. Joshua was in constant motion. Calls, confirmations, last-minute adjustments. His attention shifted rapidly, but his energy remained focused. This was his moment. He felt it in the way people responded to him, in the tone of their voices, in the deference that had begun to replace skepticism. Success had changed the way others interacted with him. And in turn, it had changed the way he interacted with them. He stood a little straighter, spoke a little more decisively, listened a little less. Naomi noticed. She did not interpret it as arrogance. Not entirely. It was something more structural. Joshua had begun to believe in a version of events that no longer required verification. That belief made him faster. It also made him vulnerable. The afternoon before the event, Naomi received another message from Andrew. No pressure, it read, but timing matters more than content in situations like this. Naomi understood. Timing was not about reaction. It was about alignment. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she opened the compiled documents again, reviewing them not for accuracy that had already been established, but for sequence. If presented in what order, would they carry the most clarity? If questioned, which elements would stand alone without requiring explanation? If challenged, which pieces would remain indisputable? She adjusted nothing. That in itself was confirmation. Everything had already been placed correctly. Later that evening, as the final arrangements were completed, Naomi prepared for the event with the same precision she applied to everything else. Her attire was simple, deliberate. Nothing that drew attention, nothing that invited interpretation. Neutral colors, clean lines, no excess. She did not dress for the room. She dressed for herself. Joshua entered the bedroom briefly as she finished. He paused, observing her in a way that suggested acknowledgement, but not inquiry. "You ready?" he asked. "Yes," Naomi replied. He nodded, adjusting his cufflinks. "This is a big night," he said, more to himself than to her. Naomi met his reflection in the mirror. "It is," she said. He smiled, slightly confident, assured. "It's going to change everything." Naomi held his gaze for a moment. "It already has," she said. Joshua did not register the difference. Or if he did not examine it. He turned, checked his phone, and left the room. Naomi remained for a few seconds longer. Not in hesitation, in stillness. Then she reached for her phone, opened a secure folder, and confirmed that the files were accessible, intact, and ready. No further action. Not yet. Outside, the first guests had begun to arrive. Cars pulled into the drive in measured intervals. Conversations started in low tones, gradually rising as familiarity took hold. Glasses were filled, introductions made. Among the arrivals were Laura Bennett and Daniel Reeves. They entered separately. Laura moved through the space with quiet awareness, her attention not on the visible displays of wealth, but on the interactions, who spoke to whom, who avoided whom, who watched without engaging. Daniel remained closer to the edges, as was his preference, observing without inserting himself unless necessary. They did not seek Naomi immediately. They did not need to. They knew she was there, and they knew with a certainty Joshua did not share, that the evening carried more than one purpose. Naomi joined the gathering without announcement. She greeted guests, politely engaged in brief conversations when addressed, and otherwise remained positioned slightly outside the center of attention. She did not avoid Joshua, but she did not orbit him either. From a distance, the image was complete. A successful man, a composed wife, a room full of witnesses to achievement. Nothing appeared out of place. Nothing suggested disruption. But beneath that surface, alignment was shifting. Not dramatically, not visibly, but precisely. Naomi moved through the evening with the same awareness she had carried into every decision leading up to it. She did not look for an opportunity. She did not create one. She waited for the moment when all elements, context, perception, and truth would converge without force. Because when that moment arrived, it would not require explanation, only presentation, and Naomi was ready. The evening unfolded with the kind of precision that made it appear effortless. Soft jazz filtered through hidden speakers, never loud enough to dominate conversation, but present enough to shape the rhythm of the room. Waitstaff moved in quiet synchronization, offering wine and curated dishes with practiced discretion. Every detail had been calibrated to sustain a single impression control. Joshua Caldwell stood at the center of it. Not physically at all times, he moved, circulated, adjusted, but in perception, he was the axis around which the evening turned. Conversations redirected when he approached. Laughter sharpened slightly in his presence. Even those who had known him before his rise now spoke to him with a measured awareness of what he had become. He accepted it easily, not with arrogance, but with familiarity, as though he had grown into something that had always been waiting for him. Naomi observed from a distance. She stood near the edge of the main living area, where the glass walls opened to the terrace. The city beyond was visible in fragments, light against darkness movement contained within structure. It mirrored the room in a way that did not go unnoticed by her. Structured movement, contained perception, selective visibility. Laura Bennett approached without announcement. "You've done well," she said, her tone neutral. Naomi turned slightly. "He," as Naomi replied. Laura studied her for a brief moment, not searching for confirmation, but for alignment. "And you?" Laura asked. Naomi's expression did not change. "I'm here," she said. Laura nodded once. It was not agreement. It was acknowledgement. Daniel Reeves joined them shortly after positioning himself just outside the immediate conversation, as he often did. He did not greet Naomi formally. He did not need to. "Timing?" he asked quietly. Naomi glanced toward Joshua, who was mid-conversation with a group of investors near the center of the room. "Not yet," she said. Daniel inclined his head slightly. He did not ask again. Across the room, Margaret Caldwell had established her own circle. She preferred groups that allowed her to speak without interruption, individuals who would listen more than question. Her presence carried a different kind of authority than Joshua's. It was less about achievement, more about expectation. She watched Naomi intermittently, not directly, never directly, but with a frequency that suggested evaluation. Eventually, she moved closer. "My friends were asking about you," Margaret said, her voice carrying the softness she used in public settings. "They're curious." Naomi met her gaze. "About what?" she asked. Margaret's smile remained intact. "Well," she said lightly, "you know how people are. They notice things." Naomi waited. "They notice when something is missing," Margaret continued. The word was chosen carefully. It carried implication without accusation. Naomi did not respond immediately. Silence in that moment did not deflect the statement. It framed it. Margaret interpreted the pause as hesitation. "It's not a criticism," she added, "just concern. Joshua has worked very hard to build all of this. Naturally, people wonder what comes next." "What comes next?" Naomi understood the structure of the conversation. Legacy positioned as inevitability, expectation framed as care, and beneath it, a reinforcement of the narrative that had been allowed to persist. Naomi inclined her head slightly. "I'm sure they do," she said. Margaret smiled, tightened just enough to register, not enough to be remarked upon. Before she could continue, Elise joined them. "Elise," Margaret said, as if inviting reinforcement. Elise glanced between them, immediately recognizing the context. "We were just discussing future plans," she said, her tone light but edged, or the lack of them. Naomi turned her attention to Elise. "For whom?" she asked. Elise's smile sharpened. "Well," she said, "some plans are more visible than others." Naomi held her gaze for a moment longer than was necessary. Not confrontational, not yielding, simply present. Then she looked away. The conversation ended without resolution. Margaret shifted her focus back to her group. Elise followed her attention, already redirecting toward a different interaction. Naomi remained where she was, not isolated, but not engaged. Across the room, Joshua's voice rose slightly above the surrounding conversations. He was recounting part of the deal process, selectively, efficiently emphasizing the moments that reinforced his role as its driving force. We had to push through a few complications, he was saying. But in the end, it came down to clarity, knowing exactly what the structure needed to look like. Clarity. Naomi noted the word. Joshua believed in it. He believed he had achieved it. Laura Bennett, now positioned within that group, listened without interruption. Her expression remained neutral, but her attention was precise. When Joshua finished, she asked a single question. "And the guarantee," she said. Joshua did not hesitate. "It's secured," he replied. Laura held his gaze for a fraction of a second longer than the question required. Then she nodded. No challenge, no confirmation, just acknowledgement. But the question lingered. Because while Joshua had answered it confidently, he'd not answered it accurately. And Laura knew the difference. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere shifted subtly but perceptibly. Conversations grew looser as more wine was poured. The structure of the event softened, allowing for less formal interactions. Clusters of guests formed and dissolved, their movement less predictable, more fluid. Joshua moved with increasing ease. His gestures became broader, his tone more animated. He laughed more freely, spoke more openly, allowed himself to occupy space without restraint. Confidence reinforced by environment. Naomi watched the shift. She noted the cadence of his speech, the slight delay in his responses, the way his focus narrowed when addressing specific topics. Alcohol did not change Joshua. It revealed him. Near the terrace, Daniel spoke again, his voice low. "He's accelerating," he said. Naomi did not look at him. "I see that," she replied. "Risk increases with speed," Daniel added. Naomi's gaze remained on Joshua. "Only when direction is uncertain," she said. Daniel considered that. "And here?" he asked. Naomi did not answer, because direction in this case was no longer Joshua's to determine. At the far end of the room, Margaret reintroduced the topic, this time with a broader audience. "It's the one thing missing," she said, her voice carrying just enough to draw attention without appearing deliberate. A family to carry all of this forward. A few guests responded with polite agreement. Some nodded. Others remained silent. Joshua, now within earshot, turned slightly. He did not interrupt immediately. But the comment registered. Naomi felt the shift before she saw it. The alignment of attention. The convergence of expectation and perception. Margaret's words did not stand alone. They were supported by repetition, by silence, by the absence of contradiction. Joshua stepped closer. "What's missing?" he asked, his tone light but edged with something less controlled. Margaret smiled. "Oh, nothing urgent," she said. "Just the natural next step." Joshua followed her gaze. It landed on Naomi. The room did not quiet, but it changed. Not in volume, in focus. Naomi met his eyes. She did not move, did not prepare, did not anticipate. Because anticipation suggested uncertainty. And Naomi was not uncertain. Joshua held her gaze for a moment. Then another. Something in his expression shifted, not fully, not clearly, but enough to suggest that the balance he had carried throughout the evening was beginning to destabilize. The conversation around them continued. But it no longer mattered, because the center of the room had moved. And this time, it was not defined by Joshua. It was defined by what would happen next. Naomi remained still, not passive, not reactive, waiting. Because the moment she had been aligning toward was no longer approaching. It had arrived. The shift did not announce itself. It did not arrive with raised voices or sudden movement. It existed first in silence, the kind that forms not from absence of sound, but from the narrowing of attention. Joshua stood a few feet away from Naomi, the distance between them no greater than it had been all evening, yet now carrying a different weight. Around them, conversations continued, but less steadily. Words overlapped, then thinned. A few guests, sensing something unspoken, slowed their speech without knowing why. Margaret watched. Elise watched. Laura Bennett did not look away. Joshua's hand still held his glass, though he no longer drank from it. His posture remained upright, but the ease that had defined his movements earlier had tightened into something less fluid. "What's missing?" He repeated his tone quieter this time, directed not at Margaret but at Naomi. Naomi did not answer immediately. She allowed the question to exist, not as a challenge, as a reflection. Joshua took a step closer. "You heard her," he said. "It's not complicated." The words were measured, but beneath them was something sharper, an irritation that had been building gradually throughout the evening now, given a focal point. Naomi met his gaze. "I heard her," she said. Her voice was even. Not soft, not firm, simply present. Joshua waited, expecting continuation. There was none. The pause extended not long enough to draw overt attention, but long enough to disrupt the rhythm of the interaction. Margaret shifted slightly as if preparing to intervene, but did not. Elise watched with interest, her expression composed, her attention precise. Joshua exhaled slowly. "This isn't something that should be avoided," he said. "People are asking. It reflects on both of us. Both of us." Naomi registered the phrasing. Not inaccurate, but incomplete. "What are they asking?" she said. Joshua's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You know what they're asking." Naomi held his gaze. "Say it," she said. The request was simple, direct. And in that simplicity, it removed the ambiguity Joshua had been operating within. For a moment, he hesitated. Not because he lacked the words, because saying them would make them explicit. But the hesitation passed quickly. "You haven't given me a child," he said. The statement landed without force. It did not need it. It had been built over time through repetition, through assumption, through the absence of contradiction. Naomi did not react. Not externally. Internally, she noted the structure. Claim, ownership, expectation. Joshua continued. "I've been patient," he added, his tone tightening. "I haven't pushed this publicly. But this," he gestured lightly, indicating the room, the guests, the context, "this matters." Naomi followed the gesture. Not with her eyes, with understanding. What mattered to Joshua was not the absence itself. It was how that absence was perceived. Reputation extended into personal territory. "You think this is about perception?" she said. Joshua's expression shifted. "It is about perception," he replied. "Everything here is." Naomi considered that, not as an argument, as confirmation. "And what do you think people see?" she asked. Joshua did not answer immediately. His silence was shorter this time, less controlled. "They see a gap," he said. "They see something missing that shouldn't be." Naomi nodded once. A small movement. Not agreement, acknowledgement. "And you've decided what that gap is?" she said. Joshua's patience thinned. "This isn't abstract, Naomi," he said. "There's a reason, and we both know what it is. We both know." The assumption rested fully in his voice now, not questioned, not examined, accepted. Naomi allowed the words to settle. Around them, the room had not stopped, but it had slowed. Conversations had lowered in volume. Movement had become less fluid. Attention, though not overtly directed, had begun to converge. Joshua did not notice, or if he did not adjust. "This isn't something I should have to keep explaining," he said. "It's already obvious. Obvious." Naomi repeated the word internally. Because what is considered obvious often depends on what is left unchallenged. "And what exactly are you explaining?" she asked. Joshua's grip on the glass tightened. "That my wife," he began, then stopped. The pause was brief, but it marked a threshold. Naomi did not move, did not interrupt, did not redirect. She waited. Joshua finished the sentence. "That my wife can't give me a child." The words were no longer contained. They extended beyond the space between them, reaching into the surrounding air, not loudly, but clearly enough. A few nearby conversations faltered. A chair shifted. Someone set a glass down with more care than before. Naomi remained still. Her expression unchanged. Her posture steady. Joshua continued the momentum of his own statement, carrying him forward. "I've done everything I'm supposed to do," he said. "I've built this again, the gesture broader now, encompassing the entire room, and I'm still expected to justify why something so basic isn't happening." The logic to him was consistent. Effort should produce outcome. Achievement should extend into all areas. And where it did not, there must be a cause. Naomi understood the structure. She had understood it long before this moment. "You're assigning responsibility?" she said. Joshua's response was immediate. "There is responsibility," he said. "And you've decided where it belongs," Naomi replied. Joshua took another step closer. Now the distance between them was minimal. "This isn't a decision," he said. "It's reality. Reality." The word settled differently than the others. Because unlike perception, unlike assumption, reality requires evidence. Naomi held his gaze. For a moment there was nothing between them but that word. Then Joshua moved. The action was not premeditated. It did not follow a visible sequence of thought. It emerged from the convergence of irritation-expectation and the absence of resistance he had grown accustomed to. His hand lifted. Not quickly, not slowly, just enough. And then the sound cut through the room. Sharp, unmistakable. A single point of impact that did not echo, but remained. Naomi's head turned slightly with the force. Not dramatically, just enough to register the contact. The room stopped. Not completely, but sufficiently. Conversations ceased mid-sentence. Movement halted mid-step. Attention, once diffused, now fixed. Joshua's hand remained suspended for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Then it lowered. He did not step back, did not apologize, did not look away. The justification, whatever form it took in his mind, held. Naomi did not raise a hand to her face, did not touch the place where his hand had been, did not speak. She straightened subtly, almost imperceptibly, and returned her head to its original position. Then she looked at him, not with anger, not with disbelief, with clarity, the kind that arrives when something anticipated finally occurs. Around them, reactions began to form. A woman near the edge of the room turned away, her expression tightening. A man beside her shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the floor. Margaret stood still, her face composed, though her hands had clasped together more tightly than before. Elise's expression did not change, but her eyes sharpened. Laura Bennett did not move. Her gaze remained on Joshua, not on Naomi, not on the aftermath, but on the action itself. Daniel Reeves exhaled quietly, almost inaudibly. Joshua looked at Naomi, waiting for what he did not fully know. Reaction, response. Something that would restore the balance he had just disrupted. Naomi held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she did something Joshua had not anticipated. Nothing. No words, no visible emotion, no attempt to correct, to confront, or to explain. She simply looked at him. And in that look, there was no submission, only recognition. Then, without haste, without drawing attention to the movement, Naomi turned. Not away in retreat, but away in decision. She stepped past him, her pace steady, her posture unchanged. The room parted not physically but perceptually as she moved toward the exit. No one stopped her. No one spoke. Joshua remained where he was. The center of the room moments ago, defined by his control, now held something else entirely. Not noise, not chaos, but consequence. He did not yet understand it, but others did. And Naomi, as she reached the threshold and stepped beyond it, understood it completely. The door closed behind Naomi without sound. Not because it was designed that way, though it was, but because no one inside the house moved to mark her leaving. No footsteps followed. No voice called her name. The silence that had formed in the wake of Joshua's action did not break. It simply held. Outside, the air was cooler. The night in Beverly Hills carried a stillness that contrasted sharply with the curated energy inside. The lights from the house spilled outward across the stone driveway, stopping just short of where Naomi stood. She did not pause to gather herself. There was nothing to gather. Her breathing remained steady, her posture unchanged. The mark on her face would surface later, subtle at first, then more defined, but in that moment, it was irrelevant. What mattered had already occurred. Not the act itself, but the confirmation of pattern. Naomi walked to her car without looking back. Inside the house, the delay stretched. Joshua remained where he was for a few seconds longer than anyone could comfortably ignore. His expression had not yet adjusted. It still carried the remnants of certainty, the belief that what had just happened, while perhaps excessive, would settle into the same structure that had allowed everything else to pass without consequence. He set his glass down. The movement was deliberate, controlled. A signal, perhaps, to himself as much as to others that the moment was contained. "It's fine," he said, though no one had asked. The words did not land. They dissipated. Laura Bennett was the first to move. Not toward Joshua, away from him. She turned slightly, addressing Daniel Reeves in a tone low enough to avoid drawing attention, but clear enough to be heard by those nearest. "We should review the final documents again," she said. Daniel nodded, agreed. It was not a reaction. It was a recalibration. Others followed in quieter ways. A couple near the far end of the room excused themselves. Another guest checked his phone, using the gesture as a reason to step outside. Conversations resumed, but not as they had before. The tone had shifted, less assured, more measured. Margaret approached Joshua. "You didn't need to do that," she said, her voice controlled, but edged. Joshua looked at her. "She made it worse," he replied. Margaret's gaze hardened slightly. "She didn't say anything," she said. Joshua exhaled. "That's the problem," he said. Elise joined them, her expression composed. "Well," she said lightly, "at least it's out in the open now." Joshua did not respond. He was beginning to feel something unfamiliar, not guilt, not yet, but disruption. The room was no longer aligning with him. The ease he had carried earlier had not returned. Across the space, Laura Bennett watched him for a moment longer. Then she looked away, not dismissively, decisively. The evening continued, but without center. Joshua moved through it, speaking when necessary, responding when addressed, but no longer directing its flow. The conversations he entered did not anchor themselves around him in the same way. There was a subtle distance now, a recalculation happening behind composed expressions. He noticed it, but he did not yet understand it. Naomi's car moved smoothly through the quiet streets, the city unfolding in controlled segments of light and shadow. She drove without music, without distraction. The route was familiar, the timing precise. Every turn, every signal, every interval between them registered without conscious effort. Her mind was not occupied with the scene she had left. It was occupied with sequence, event, confirmation, next step. By the time she reached the house in Palo Alto, the structure of what would follow had already aligned. Inside, the space was still. No voices, no movement, just the controlled quiet of a place designed for order. Naomi placed her keys on the table, removed her coat, and walked directly to her study. She did not check her phone. Not yet. She did not look at her reflection. There was nothing there she needed to assess. She sat at her desk and opened her laptop. The screen illuminated the room in a soft, contained glow. The file Andrew had sent remained where she had stored it, encrypted, duplicated, organized. Naomi opened it. Not to review, to begin. Her process was methodical. First, she created a working document, separate from the original, structured not by legal complexity, but by clarity of impact. She identified the key elements, the origin of the financial guarantees, the pathway of capital through intermediary entities, the contractual clauses that granted intervention rights, the timeline of involvement. Each element was extracted, labeled, and placed in sequence. Then she cross-referenced them with the corresponding bank records. Every transfer matched, every timestamp aligned. There were no gaps, no inconsistencies. The structure held. Next, she opened the email chains, conversations between Andrew and Bennett Capital, between intermediary entities, between parties that on the surface appeared unrelated. She selected only what was necessary. No excess, no commentary, just evidence. Her phone vibrated. Naomi glanced at the screen. Andrew Collins. She answered. "It's done," he said. Naomi did not ask what he meant. She understood. "The room?" she asked. "Shifted," he replied. "Not immediately, but enough." Naomi nodded, though he could not see it. "And him?" she asked. A brief pause. "He doesn't see it yet," Andrew said, "but others do." That was sufficient. "I'm preparing the documents," Naomi said. "Do you want to move now?" Andrew asked. Naomi considered the question, not in terms of readiness, in terms of alignment. "No," she said. "Tomorrow." Another pause. "Morning?" he asked. "Yes." Andrew exhaled quietly. "Then we'll proceed," he said. The call ended. Naomi returned to her work. She compiled the selected materials into a single file, structured, indexed, and accessible without interpretation. At the top, she placed a summary. Not an argument, not an explanation, a statement of fact. She read it once, then closed the document. The rest would follow in sequence. Back in Beverly Hills, the event had begun to dissolve. Guests left in staggered intervals, their departures polite, measured but earlier than expected. The energy that had been carefully constructed at the beginning of the evening no longer held. Joshua stood near the entrance, thanking those who remained. His tone controlled his posture steady. But the alignment was gone. Laura Bennett approached him last. "Congratulations," she said. Joshua inclined his head. "Thank you," he replied. A pause. Then Laura added, "We'll be in touch." The words were neutral, but their meaning had shifted. Joshua nodded. "Of course." She held his gaze for a moment, then turned and left. Daniel followed shortly after, offering only a brief acknowledgement. The door closed. Joshua stood alone in the entryway. The house moments ago, filled with movement and sound, had returned to stillness. He looked around. Everything remained as it had been. The arrangement, the lighting, the space, unchanged. And yet something had moved. Not visibly, not tangibly, but definitively. Joshua reached for his phone. There were messages from investors, from his team. Short, measured, requesting clarification, requesting confirmation, requesting review. He frowned slightly, not in concern, in confusion. Because as far as he understood, everything was secure. In Palo Alto, Naomi closed her laptop. The documents were ready, the structure was clear, the timing aligned. She turned off the light and left the study. The house remained silent, unchanged. But unlike Joshua, Naomi understood the difference between appearance and position. Because while nothing visible had shifted, yet control already had. Naomi woke before the light fully settled over the house. Not abruptly, not from restlessness. Her sleep had been uninterrupted, measured, and sufficient. She opened her eyes with the same clarity she carried into every decision, without hesitation, without lingering between states. For a moment, she remained still, not reflecting, not revisiting, simply aligning. The events of the previous evening did not replay in her mind. They did not need to. What had happened had already moved from occurrence into structure. It had taken its place within a sequence that was now fully formed. She rose dressed and returned to her study. The laptop remained where she had left it. The documents organized, distilled, precise, weighted without urgency. Naomi opened the file. This time she read it not as its architect, but as its recipient. Each section stood independently. Each piece of evidence required no interpretation. It was not designed to persuade. It was designed to establish. At the center of the document was a simple, unembellished statement. Primary financial guarantee and capital stabilization for Caldwell Logistics expansion, origin and control. Below it, the structure unfolded, not in legal language, in clarity. The capital securing the $900 million transaction originated from entities directly controlled by Naomi Caldwell, operating through Langford-aligned intermediaries. The guarantee provided to Bennett Capital and associated investors is contingent upon Naomi Caldwell's authorization. Without said guarantee, the transaction is non-compliant with agreed risk thresholds and subject to immediate reevaluation. No accusation, no commentary, only position. Naomi closed the file. Then she opened another, the audio. It had been recorded months earlier during a late-night call Joshua had taken in his office. Naomi had not intended to record it. The system in place captured conversations for internal reference, a standard precaution within the Langford network. Joshua had forgotten it was active. If this fails, he had said, his voice sharp with frustration, it's on her. She handles the structure. That's her responsibility. The words had not stood out at the time, not as significant. But context alters weight. Naomi listened once. Then she stopped the file. It would not be used as leverage, only as alignment. Her phone vibrated. Andrew Collins. She answered. Everything is in place, he said. We can initiate the notification process. Naomi leaned back slightly in her chair. Walk me through the sequence, she said. Andrew did not hesitate. First formal disclosure to Bennett Capital and primary investors, he began. Not a challenge, just a clarification of guarantor identity and authority. Naomi listened. Second parallel notice to Caldwell Logistics Board, he continued, including documentation of financial structure and contingency clauses. And timing, Naomi asked. Simultaneous, Andrew replied. No gap for narrative adjustment. Naomi nodded. Good, she said. There was a brief pause. Once it's sent, Andrew added, there's no retraction. I'm aware, Naomi said. Another pause. Are you certain about today, he asked. Naomi considered the question, not because she doubted, because certainty in her world was always examined before it was acted upon. Yes, she said. Andrew exhaled quietly. Then we proceed in 30 minutes. The call ended. Naomi did not move immediately. She allowed the timing to settle. 30 minutes, enough for alignment, not enough for interference. Across the state, Joshua Caldwell had not slept as well. He had not woken early. He had woken abruptly. His phone had been active throughout the night, messages arriving at irregular intervals, each one similar in tone. Brief, measured, requesting clarification. He sat at the edge of his bed, scrolling through them again. Laura Bennett. We need to review the guarantee structure. Call me when available. Daniel Reeves. Something doesn't align. Check your documentation. His CFO investors are asking about funding source verification. Do we have updated confirmation? Joshua frowned. The questions did not make sense. The structure was secure. He knew it was. He had been told it was. He stood, moving quickly now, pulling on a shirt as he walked toward his office. The house still carried the remnants of the previous night glasses left where they had been set down, chairs slightly out of place, the quiet aftermath of an event that had not ended cleanly. He ignored it. There were more immediate concerns. In his office, he opened his laptop, pulling up the deal documents. Everything appeared as it should. The agreements, the signatures, the structure. He scanned the sections related to the guarantee. It was there. Defined. Secured. He exhaled, tension easing slightly. This was a misunderstanding. A temporary misalignment. Nothing more. His phone rang. Laura Bennett. He answered immediately. Laura, he said. Her voice was calm. Joshua, she replied. We've received a document this morning. Joshua paused. What document, he asked. A clarification of guarantor identity, she said. Joshua frowned. That doesn't make sense, he replied. The guarantor is already defined. Yes, Laura said. It is. A brief silence. And it isn't you. The words did not land immediately, not because they were unclear, because they did not fit. "That's not correct," Joshua said. "It is," Laura replied. Joshua stood still. "Send it to me," he said. "You already have it," Laura said. Then the line went quiet. Naomi sat at her desk as the clock moved through the final minutes. She did not watch it. She did not count. She simply waited. At exactly the 30-minute mark, her screen updated. Andrew's message appeared. Sent. No additional text. No confirmation needed. Naomi opened her email. The document had been distributed to all relevant parties. Bennett Capital, primary investors, Caldwell Logistics Board. Her name appeared where it had not appeared before. Not introduced, revealed. She did not read the responses, not yet, because reaction was not the point. Position was. Joshua refreshed his inbox. The email was there. He opened it. The document loaded. At first glance, it appeared technical, structured, neutral. Then he saw it. The name, Naomi Caldwell. His eyes moved quickly through the text, the pathways, the guarantees, the clauses, each one connected, each one pointing to the same conclusion. He read it again, slower, more carefully. The structure held. There were no gaps, no inconsistencies, no errors. This was not a mistake. It was a reality he had not been aware of. His grip on the desk tightened. He opened the attached files, bank records, transfer confirmations, legal agreements, all aligned, all traceable, all hers. Joshua stepped back slightly as if distance might alter what he was seeing. It did not. His phone began to ring again. He did not answer. For the first time since the deal had begun, Joshua Caldwell did not have control over the narrative in front of him, because it was no longer his. In Palo Alto, Naomi closed her email. The process had begun, not loudly, not publicly, but definitively. She stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the quiet landscape beyond the glass. There was no change, no visible shift. But she knew. The structure had been corrected, the imbalance addressed, not through confrontation, not through reaction, through sequence, through timing, through truth placed exactly where it could no longer be ignored. Behind her, the laptop remained open, the documents still visible, unchanged, because they did not need to change. They only needed to be seen. The first wave of consequences did not arrive with noise. It arrived with questions, not accusations, not conclusions. Just questions precise, measured, and directed at the one person who no longer had the answers. Joshua Caldwell stood in his office, the morning light cutting across the floor in clean geometric lines. His phone rested on the desk in front of him, vibrating at intervals that were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. He let it ring, for a few seconds longer than necessary. Then he answered. "Daniel," he said. On the other end, Daniel Reeves did not waste time. "You've seen the document," he said. Joshua's jaw tightened. "I have," he replied. And Daniel asked. Joshua turned slightly, looking out the window, though he wasn't seeing anything beyond the reflection of his own expression. "It doesn't change the structure," Joshua said. "The deal is already closed." A pause. "Structure isn't the issue," Daniel said. "Control is." Joshua exhaled slowly. "The guarantee is in place," he said. "That's what matters." "No," Daniel replied. "What matters is who holds it." Joshua did not respond. Because for the first time, the distinction was not theoretical. It was operational. Daniel continued. "The clauses tied to that guarantee, have you reviewed them recently?" he asked. Joshua's silence extended. "I'm looking at them now," he said. "Look again," Daniel said. "Specifically, the intervention rights." The line went quiet. Joshua ended the call without further comment. He turned back to his laptop, pulling up the relevant section of the agreement. He had read it before, multiple times. But not like this, not with the assumption removed. The clause was written in language that appeared standard, conditional, structured, embedded within broader provisions. But now, with Naomi's name attached to the guarantee, its meaning shifted. In the event of material risk exposure, the guarantor retains the right to intervene in operational and financial decision-making to preserve asset stability. Joshua read it once. Then again. The words did not change, but their position did. This was not a passive safeguard. It was an entry point. His phone rang again. This time, he answered without checking the caller. Joshua, his CFO, said, his voice tighter than usual. "We have a situation." Joshua closed his eyes briefly. "I'm aware," he said. "No," the CFO replied. "I don't think you are." Joshua's grip on the phone tightened. "Then explain," he said. "The investors are requesting immediate clarification on governance," the CFO said, "specifically how decision-making authority is affected by the guarantor's position." Joshua walked to the edge of his desk. "It isn't affected," he said. "Not unless there's a breach." Another pause. "They're asking what constitutes a breach," the CFO said. Joshua didn't answer immediately, because the answer was no longer simple. And he asked. "And we don't have a clear definition that excludes discretionary interpretation," the CFO said. Joshua's expression hardened. "That's standard language," he said. "It is," the CFO replied. When the guarantor is aligned with the operator, Joshua understood. Alignment. The word carried more weight now than it had the night before. "And if it isn't?" Joshua asked. The CFO hesitated. "Then the guarantor defines the threshold," he said. Silence. Joshua ended the call. He stood there for a moment, the space around him unchanged, but no longer neutral. The structure he had relied on, the one he believed he had built, was still intact, but it no longer belonged to him entirely to him. Across the network, the reactions continued to unfold. Not dramatically, not publicly, but with increasing precision. Emails were exchanged, calls were scheduled, meetings were requested, each one framed as clarification, each one carrying the same underlying question. Who controls the deal at Bennett Capital? Laura Bennett sat at the head of a small conference table, the document Naomi had sent open in front of her. Her team reviewed the details in silence. They did not question the validity. They questioned the implications. "She holds the guarantee," one of her analysts said. "Yes," Laura replied. "And the intervention clause gives her leverage over operations," another added. Laura nodded. "Correct." A pause. "So where does that leave Caldwell?" the first analyst asked. Laura leaned back slightly. "Dependent," she said. "Not eliminated, not replaced, but no longer autonomous." In Palo Alto, Naomi remained in her study. The morning had progressed without interruption. No calls, no messages she needed to respond to immediately. She had expected this. The first phase was not about communication. It was about recalibration. She opened her laptop again, not to monitor responses, but to prepare the next step. Andrew had outlined it clearly. Formalization. The document had introduced the structure. Now it needed to be enforced. Naomi reviewed the legal framework tied to her position. The intervention clause, the governance implications, the procedural steps required to activate them. She did not move immediately, because activation, like disclosure, required timing. Too early, and it would appear reactive. Too late, and it would allow others to redefine the narrative. Her phone vibrated. This time, she looked at the screen. Joshua. She let it ring once, twice. Then she answered. "Naomi," he said. His voice was controlled, but the control was deliberate, not natural. "I received the document," he continued. "I assumed you would," she replied. A pause. "What is this?" he asked. Naomi considered the question, not because she didn't understand it, because she wanted to answer it precisely. "It's a clarification," she said. Joshua exhaled sharply. "That's not an answer," he said. "It's an accurate one," Naomi replied. Another pause. "You're listed as the guarantor," he said. Why Naomi did not respond immediately, not out of hesitation, out of sequence. "Because the guarantee originates from me," she said. Joshua's grip on the phone tightened. "That's not how this was structured," he said. "It is," Naomi replied. Silence. Joshua stepped away from his desk, pacing once across the room. "You're saying the entire deal?" he began, then stopped. Naomi waited. "You're saying it depends on you," he finished. Naomi's voice remained even. "It always has," she said. The words settled into the space between them, not as a challenge, as a fact. Joshua's next question came slower. "Why wasn't I told?" he asked. Naomi considered that, then answered. "You didn't ask," she said. The simplicity of the response carried more weight than any explanation. Joshua stopped moving. "That's not," he began, then paused, because the argument he was reaching for required a premise he could no longer fully support. "You let me believe," he said. Naomi did not interrupt. "You believed what aligned with your position," she said. Joshua's silence returned, not empty, processing. And now he asked. Naomi looked at the documents in front of her, then out the window. "Now the structure is visible," she said. Another pause. "And what does that mean?" Joshua asked. Naomi's answer came without delay. "It means decisions are no longer unilateral," she said. Joshua closed his eyes briefly. "And if I don't agree?" he asked. Naomi's tone did not change. "Agreement isn't required," she said. The line went quiet, not disconnected, just still. Joshua understood. Not completely, not yet, but enough. Because for the first time since the deal had begun, his position was not defined by what he controlled, but by what he no longer did. Naomi ended the call. She did not revisit it, did not analyze it. It had served its purpose. Clarity had been established. She returned to her work. The next step was ready. Not urgent, but inevitable. Because once control shifts, it does not return to where it was. The second wave did not ask questions. It answered them. By mid-morning, the document Naomi had authorized was no longer a point of inquiry. It had become a reference. Not debated, not disputed, but used, forwarded, cited, inserted into conversations that no longer included speculation. At Caldwell Logistics, the board members had received the same file at precisely the same moment as the investors. That timing mattered. It removed the space in which interpretation could be shaped privately before being challenged publicly. Now, everything unfolded at once. The emergency board meeting was scheduled within the hour. No delay, no attempt to soften the urgency. The subject line alone was sufficient immediate review, financial guarantee, and governance implications. Joshua entered the conference room 10 minutes early. Not because he wanted to, because he needed time. The space was familiar glass walls, a long table screens positioned for clarity. It had always been a place where he defined direction, where decisions moved outward from his position. Today it felt different, not physically, structurally. He placed his laptop on the table and opened it, pulling up the document again. He had read it multiple times. Each time, it revealed less. Not because it was unclear, because it was complete. There was nothing left to reinterpret. The door opened. Board members entered one by one. Robert Klein, the senior advisor, took his usual seat near the center. Angela Morris, representing one of the larger institutional investors, sat across from Joshua, her expression neutral. Others followed. No one spoke immediately. They did not need to. The document had already framed the conversation. Joshua closed his laptop. "Let's begin," he said. Robert nodded. "Then clarify," he replied. "We've all read the material." Joshua leaned forward slightly. "The guarantee structure has always been in place," he said. "This document doesn't change the deal." Angela spoke next. "It changes control," she said. Joshua met her gaze. "Only under specific conditions," he replied. Angela tilted her head slightly. "And who defines those conditions?" she asked. Joshua did not answer immediately, because the answer no longer belonged to him. Robert stepped in. "The clause is discretionary," he said. "The guarantor determines risk exposure." Joshua's jaw tightened. "That's standard," he said. "It is," Robert agreed, "when the guarantor and operator are aligned." Silence. The word returned again. "Alignment." Joshua looked around the table. You're assuming misalignment, he said. Angela responded. We're acknowledging the possibility, she said. Joshua leaned back. This is premature, he said. There's no indication that intervention is necessary. Robert folded his hands. There's also no indication that it isn't, he said. The distinction was precise and deliberate. Joshua exhaled slowly. What exactly are you proposing? He asked. Angela glanced at the others, then back at him. Clarification of governance, she said. Effective immediately. Joshua's expression hardened. Meaning, he asked. Robert answered. Shared oversight on key financial decisions, he said, until alignment is confirmed. Joshua's gaze sharpened. You're restructuring authority based on a document that was sent this morning, he said. Angela did not look away. We're restructuring authority based on information we didn't have yesterday, she said. The room held, because that was the core of it, not change, correction. Joshua stood, not abruptly, but with intention. This company is operationally stable, he said. The deal is secure. There's no justification for this level of intervention. Robert watched him. There is, he said. You just don't control it anymore. The words landed without emphasis, but they carried weight. Joshua's silence followed. Not because he had nothing to say, because what he could say no longer altered the outcome. At Bennett Capital, the same conclusion had already been reached. Laura Bennett sat in a smaller meeting room, now her team having finalized their assessment. We proceed, she said. No one questioned it. Not because they agreed blindly, because the structure supported it. The guarantor has priority, one of her analysts noted. Yes, Laura said. And Caldwell, another, asked. Laura considered that briefly. Remains involved, she said, but not independently. The distinction was subtle, but decisive. Back in Palo Alto, Naomi received the first formal response. Not from Joshua, from the board. A request, concise, professional. Request for confirmation of guarantor position and willingness to engage in governance alignment discussions. Naomi read it once, then forwarded it to Andrew. Her message contained only 2 words. Proceed accordingly. Andrew responded within minutes. Acknowledged. Drafting response. Naomi did not review it immediately. She trusted the structure. The process had already been defined. In the conference room, the discussion had shifted. Not to whether authority would change, but how. Joshua remained standing, his position unchanged. But the room had moved around him. Angela spoke again. We're not removing you, she said. We're stabilizing the structure. Joshua looked at her. You're redefining it, he said. Robert nodded slightly. Yes, he said. Joshua's gaze moved across the table, each face, each expression, measured, resolved. No hesitation, no uncertainty. The decision had already been made. This meeting was not about reaching it. It was about formalizing it. Joshua sat down. The movement was controlled. But it marked something, not surrender, recognition. What's the next step, he asked. Angela answered. We engage with the guarantor, she said. Joshua's expression remained still. You mean Naomi, he said. Angela held his gaze. Yes, she said. The name settled differently in the room now, not as his wife, not as a peripheral figure, but as position, as authority, as control. Naomi stood by the window when Andrew called. They've initiated governance alignment, he said. Naomi nodded. As expected, she replied. They want to schedule a formal discussion, Andrew continued. With you? Naomi considered that, not the request, the timing, when she asked. This afternoon, Andrew said. Naomi looked out at the landscape, still unchanged, still quiet. Confirm, she said. A pause. They'll expect you to lead, Andrew added. Naomi's expression did not shift. I will, she said. The call ended. Naomi turned back to her desk. The documents remained open, the structure intact, but now visible, recognized, operational. She did not feel satisfaction, did not feel victory, because this was not an outcome. It was a correction, a realignment of what had always been true, now placed where it could no longer be ignored. In the conference room, the meeting concluded without resolution, because resolution had already occurred. Joshua gathered his things slowly, no urgency, no visible reaction. But as he walked out of the room, one thing had become clear. He was no longer at the center of the structure he believed he controlled. And for the first time, everyone else knew it. The meeting was scheduled for 2:00 p.m., not as a negotiation. As a confirmation, by the time the participants joined, the outcome had already aligned through documents clauses and the quiet consensus of those who understood what had shifted. Naomi entered the call precisely on time. No earlier, no delay. Her screen illuminated with a grid of faces: board members, legal representatives, investors. Joshua was there as well, positioned in the same frame he had occupied in countless meetings before, but not in the same role. Naomi did not acknowledge him first. She acknowledged the room. "Thank you for joining," she said. Her voice carried no emphasis, no adjustment, just clarity. Andrew Collins appeared in a smaller window beside her, silent but present. Robert Klein spoke first. "We appreciate your availability," he said. "We'd like to confirm your position as guarantor and understand how you intend to proceed." Naomi inclined her head slightly. "My position is as outlined in the document," she said. "Primary guarantor of the capital structure supporting the transaction. No elaboration, no expansion." Angela Morris followed. "And your intention regarding governance?" she asked. Naomi paused. "Not for effect, for precision. My intention is to maintain stability," she said. The words were simple, but in that simplicity, they defined scope. Joshua leaned forward. "And how do you define stability?" he asked. Naomi turned her attention to him for the first time. "Alignment between capital risk and operational decisions," she said. Joshua's expression tightened slightly. "That's already in place," he said. Naomi did not respond immediately, because the statement was not incorrect. It was incomplete. "Not consistently," she said. The room held. Joshua's gaze remained fixed. "Give an example," he said. Naomi did not look at her notes. She did not need them. "Public exposure without structural confirmation," she said. The reference was indirect, but clear. Joshua understood. The event, the statements, the assumption of security. He leaned back slightly. "That doesn't affect the deal," he said. Naomi's response was immediate. "It affects risk perception," she said. Angela nodded faintly. "And perception affects stability," she added. Joshua's attention shifted briefly toward her. Then back to Naomi. "So what are you proposing?" he asked. Naomi's tone did not change. "Shared oversight on financial decisions exceeding defined thresholds," she said. Joshua's jaw tightened. "That's already been suggested," he said. "It's unnecessary." Naomi met his gaze. "It's required," she said. The distinction was not emphasized, but it was final. Robert leaned forward slightly. "Can you specify the thresholds?" he asked. Naomi nodded. "Any decision that alters capital exposure beyond pre-agreed margins," she said, "including expansion restructuring and public commitments tied to valuation." Joshua exhaled slowly. "That restricts operational flexibility," he said. Naomi considered that, then replied, "It restricts unilateral risk," she said. Silence followed, not empty, weighted, because the structure of the conversation had shifted. This was no longer about defending positions. It was about defining them. Joshua spoke again. "And if I disagree with your assessment of risk?" he asked. Naomi's answer came without delay. "Then the clause allows intervention," she said. The words settled into the room. Clear, unambiguous, not aggressive, but absolute. Joshua's gaze held for a moment longer, then moved away, because the argument he had been building no longer had a foundation. Angela spoke next. "This aligns with investor expectations," she said. Robert nodded. "And board responsibility," he added. Joshua remained still, not silent, but without immediate response. Naomi continued. "There is no intention to disrupt operations," she said, "only to ensure that decisions reflect the structure that supports them." Her tone remained even. No escalation, no justification, just definition. Andrew spoke for the first time. "We will formalize the governance adjustments following this meeting," he said. "Documentation will reflect the thresholds and intervention rights discussed." Joshua looked at him briefly, then back at Naomi. "This was already formalized," he said. Andrew did not react. "It was embedded," he replied. "Now it is being applied." Joshua's expression hardened slightly, but he did not respond, because the distinction was accurate. Naomi watched him, not with judgment, with recognition. This was not the moment of collapse. It was the moment of understanding. Partial, incomplete, but irreversible. Angela glanced at her notes. "There's one more point," she said. "Public representation." Joshua looked up. "What about it?" he asked. Angela met his gaze. "Going forward, statements regarding the deal should reflect the full structure," she said. Joshua's posture shifted. "You want me to announce this?" he asked. Naomi answered before Angela could. "No," she said. Joshua looked at her. "Then what?" he asked. Naomi's expression remained unchanged. "You acknowledge it when relevant," she said. Joshua's eyes narrowed slightly. "And if it's not relevant?" he asked. Naomi held his gaze. "It is," she said. The room fell quiet again, because this was not about communication. It was about reality. And reality, once established, does not depend on convenience. Robert cleared his throat. "I believe we have alignment," he said. Angela nodded. "We do," she agreed. Joshua did not confirm, but he did not object. And in that absence, the outcome settled. Andrew began outlining the next procedural steps: documentation, signatures, implementation timeline. Naomi listened, not because she needed the details, but because she understood the importance of sequence. Everything would be recorded. Everything would be enforceable. Everything would move forward. The meeting concluded without formality. No closing statements, no summaries. Just a gradual withdrawal of presence. Screens dimmed, windows closed, until only two remained: Naomi and Joshua. For a moment, neither spoke. The space between them was no longer shared. It was defined. Joshua broke the silence. "You could have told me," he said. Naomi considered the statement, not as an accusation, as a reflection. "I could have," she said. Joshua's gaze held. "But you didn't," he said. Naomi nodded. "No," she said. A pause. "Why?" he asked. Naomi's answer came without hesitation. "Because you didn't listen when it mattered," she said. The words were not sharp, not emotional, just accurate. Joshua looked away, not in defeat, in processing. Because the question he had asked required an answer he was only beginning to understand. Naomi watched him for a moment longer, then closed the call. No farewell, no continuation, because nothing remained to be said. The structure had been defined, the roles established. And for the first time, Joshua Caldwell was no longer operating within a system he controlled. He was operating within one he had never fully seen. And Naomi had never left. The restructuring did not announce itself publicly. There were no headlines, no statements issued to the press, no visible shift in branding or leadership that an outside observer could immediately identify. From a distance, Caldwell Logistics remained intact. Internally, it had changed completely. The formal documents were finalized within 48 hours, precise, exhaustive, binding. They did not introduce anything new. They clarified what had always been embedded, now expressed in terms that could not be reinterpreted. Naomi Caldwell was listed as the primary financial guarantor. Her authority was defined not in general language, but in operational terms: co-approval required for capital exposure beyond defined thresholds. Oversight rights on expansion strategy. Immediate intervention authority under discretionary risk conditions. Joshua Caldwell remained CEO. The title did not change. The function did. On the third day, Joshua returned to the office, not because he needed to prove anything, because routine was the only structure that had not shifted. The building was the same, glass steel-controlled light. The reception area unchanged. Staff moved as they always had, efficient, focused, aware. But something in their awareness had adjusted. It was not disrespect. It was not avoidance. It was distance. Subtle, measured, but present. Joshua walked through the space without acknowledging it, because acknowledgement would require interpretation. And interpretation at this stage would not alter anything. In his office, the documents waited. He did not open them. He already knew what they contained. Instead, he reviewed operational reports, revenue projections, logistics updates, metrics that had once defined his control. They still did, but now they required confirmation beyond him. A notification appeared on his screen. Approval required. Capital reallocation, pending secondary authorization. Joshua stared at it for a moment, then clicked. The interface was familiar. The process was not. At the bottom of the request, a second line remained incomplete. Guarantor authorization pending. He did not move immediately, because this was not a technical delay. It was a structural one. Joshua closed the window, not to avoid it, to understand it. Across the building, conversations had shifted, not in volume, in direction. Teams that had once escalated decisions directly to Joshua now followed a different sequence. Initial review, secondary verification, guarantor alignment. The process was not slower. It was layered, and in that layering, authority had been redistributed. Margaret Caldwell noticed the change before she understood it. She had always relied on proximity, her influence extending through Joshua's position, her voice carrying weight because it aligned with his. Now that alignment no longer functioned the same way. She called him that afternoon. "You need to correct this," she said. Joshua leaned back in his chair. "It's already been corrected," he replied. Margaret's tone sharpened. "This isn't what we discussed," she said. Joshua's expression remained still. "We didn't discuss it," he said. A pause. "What does that mean?" she asked. Joshua looked at the screen in front of him. "It means it wasn't my decision," he said. Silence. Margaret processed that. Not quickly, not easily. "Then whose was it?" she asked. Joshua did not answer immediately, because the answer once spoken would redefine more than just the situation. "It's handled," he said. Margaret's voice tightened. "That's not an answer," she said. Joshua's response came slower this time. "It's the only one that matters," he said. He ended the call before she could respond. Elise did not call. She did not ask. She observed. From a distance. From conversations that no longer included her directly. From the absence of information that had once been available through casual proximity. And in that absence, she understood something Margaret had not yet accepted. The structure had moved beyond them. At Bennett Capital, the adjustment was already complete. Laura Bennett reviewed the updated governance documents without comment. Her team had incorporated the changes into their models. Risk exposure had decreased. Control had stabilized. The outcome was not unexpected. It was optimal. "Caldwell remains operational," one of her analysts noted. "Yes," Laura said. And Naomi, the analyst, asked. Laura closed the file. "She was always operational," she said. The distinction required no explanation. In Palo Alto, Naomi's routine had not changed. She continued her work as she always had. Quietly, precisely, without visibility beyond what was necessary. The difference was not in what she did. It was in how it was recognized. Requests now came directly. From the board, from investors, from teams that had previously operated around her. She did not increase her presence. She did not assert her position. She responded, only when required, only as needed. Control to Naomi was not expressed through frequency. It was expressed through accuracy. The divorce filing was submitted on a Tuesday morning. No announcement, no discussion, just documentation. Filed through Andrew Collins, structured with the same precision as everything else she had done. Irreconcilable differences, division of assets, clarification of financial entitlements, included within the sealed documents medical records. Not public, not referenced, but present, Joshua received the notice electronically. He opened it in his office. Read it once. Then again. The language was neutral, clinical, devoid of emotion. It did not reference the event, did not assign blame. It did not need to. At the end of the document, a section remained sealed, accessible only through legal review. He knew what it contained, not because he had seen it, because he understood the pattern. Naomi did not introduce information without purpose, and she did not expose it without necessity. This was not exposure. It was position. Joshua closed the file. He did not react immediately, because reaction implied surprise. And nothing about this was unexpected. Not anymore. The office remained active around him, unchanged in function, altered in structure. Joshua stood, walked to the window, looked out of the city he had once moved through with certainty. That certainty had not disappeared. It had shifted, no longer anchored in control, but in recognition. Recognition of what had been present, unseen, unacknowledged, until it could no longer remain that way. Later that evening, Naomi returned to the Palo Alto house. She moved through it as she always had. No adjustments, no hesitation. The space did not reflect change, because change in her world was not expressed through environment. It was expressed through alignment. She placed her bag on the table, walked to her study, opened her laptop. There were messages, requests, updates. She addressed them in sequence. Not urgently, not slowly, precisely. The divorce filing did not require her attention. It had already been executed. Everything that needed to be stated had been stated. Joshua remained in his office long after the building had emptied. The lights dimmed automatically, the space quiet. He sat at his desk, the documents still open, the structure still visible. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the full sequence. Not just the deal, not just the meeting, everything. The conversations, the assumptions, the moments he had not examined. And within them, the pattern. Naomi had not changed. She had remained consistent. He had, in perception, in belief, in the assumption of control. He leaned back, closed his eyes briefly, not in exhaustion, in clarity, because understanding, once it arrives, does not announce itself. It settles. And once it does not leave. The divorce proceedings moved forward without spectacle. No press coverage, no public filings beyond what was legally required. The case remained contained within the system, structured, documented, and deliberate. That was not by accident. It was by design. Naomi did not attend the first hearing in person. She joined remotely, not to distance herself from the process, but to maintain control over its framing. Presence in her world was not defined by physical location. It was defined by precision. Joshua sat in the courtroom, alone. His legal team positioned beside him, composed, prepared, efficient. They had reviewed the documents. They understood the structure of the case. But even they recognized something unusual. There was no aggression, no attempt to escalate, no strategy designed to corner or expose, only clarity. Andrew Collins represented Naomi. He stood when addressed, spoke when required, and never extended beyond what was necessary. The judge reviewed the initial filings. Grounds irreconcilable differences, she read. Standard, unremarkable. But the documentation attached to the case was not. Financial disclosures, asset structures, ownership clarifications. Everything aligned with the restructuring that had already taken place. There was no dispute over division, because Naomi had not built her position through ambiguity. She had built it through documentation. Joshua's attorney spoke briefly. "We request review of the sealed materials before proceeding further," he said. The judge nodded. "Granted," she replied. The sealed file was transferred. Joshua did not look at it immediately. Not because he hesitated, because he already understood what it would contain. When he did open it, he did so alone. The document was clinical. No narrative. No interpretation. Just medical records. Dates, evaluations, conclusions. The language was precise. Diagnosis: non-obstructive azoospermia. Permanent, not situational, not temporary. Joshua read the line once. Then again. The words did not change. They did not require interpretation. They required acknowledgement. Below it, a second section. Documentation of Naomi's medical evaluation. Clear, unrestricted. No complications. The contrast was not emphasized. It did not need to be. Joshua closed the file. Not abruptly, carefully. He placed it on the table in front of him and sat back. There was no immediate reaction. No visible shift. But something settled. Not externally, internally. Because the narrative he had accepted, repeated, reinforced, left unchallenged, no longer existed. And more importantly, it had never existed. In the courtroom, Andrew did not reference the medical records. He did not introduce them into open discussion. He did not need to. Their presence alone was sufficient. They were not a weapon. They were a boundary. Joshua's attorney glanced at him briefly. A question, unspoken. Joshua did not respond. Because there was nothing to contest. The proceedings continued. Measured, efficient. The division of assets confirmed. The separation of financial interests aligned with existing documentation. There was no argument, no resistance, because resistance required leverage. And leverage, in this case, did not exist on his side. Margaret Caldwell did not attend. She had been informed, not invited. Her response had been immediate. "This is unnecessary," she had said. Joshua had not argued, not because he agreed, because explanation would not alter her position. She did not know about the sealed file. Elise suspected, but did not ask. Naomi remained composed on the screen. She spoke only when addressed. Her responses were direct, unemotional, complete. At one point, the judge asked, "Is there any intention to contest the grounds?" Naomi answered, "No." Joshua's attorney looked at him. Joshua shook his head once. "No," he said. The word settled into the record, not as defeat, as conclusion. The finalization was scheduled, not immediate, but inevitable. There were no delays, no complications, because the structure had been resolved before the process began. After the session ended, Joshua remained seated for a moment longer. The courtroom emptied gradually. Voices faded, footsteps receded, until only the quiet remained. He looked at the table in front of him, at the file, still closed, but no longer unknown. For the first time, he allowed the full sequence to align. Not just the deal, not just the restructuring, everything. The conversations at dinner, the assumptions, the silence he had mistaken for agreement, the moments he had chosen not to examine. And within them, Naomi. Not reacting, not correcting, not opposing, but observing, recording, positioning. He exhaled slowly, not in frustration, in recognition, because what had happened was not sudden. It had been building. He simply had not seen it. Outside, the day continued as it always did. Traffic moved, people walked. The world did not adjust to his understanding. It never had. Naomi closed her laptop after the session. The house in Palo Alto remained quiet, unchanged. She stood for a moment, not reflecting, not revisiting, just present. The process was not complete, but it was no longer uncertain. She walked through the house once, not to inspect, to confirm. Everything was where it needed to be. She picked up her keys, paused briefly, then left. No hesitation, no attachment. Because departure in her world was not defined by emotion. It was defined by completion. Joshua returned to his office later that afternoon. The building remained active. But his presence moved through it differently now, not diminished, not erased, but redefined. He sat at his desk, opened his laptop, the same documents, the same structure, but now understood fully. He did not call Naomi, did not message, did not attempt to reopen what had already closed, because there was nothing left to clarify. The truth had been presented, not argued, not imposed, just placed. And once placed, it could not be undone. That evening, as the city shifted toward night, both of them moved forward, not in parallel, not in opposition, but separately. One continuing with what had always been known, the other finally seeing it. And understanding came too late to change anything. Time did not mark the ending. It absorbed it. There was no single moment when everything concluded, no final exchange, no decisive event that closed the distance between what had been and what remained. Instead, the separation settled gradually like a structure that had already shifted beneath the surface long before anyone noticed it above. 3 months passed. Caldwell Logistics continued to operate. From the outside, nothing appeared significantly altered. The company maintained its trajectory, its partnerships intact, its expansion progressing along the same lines that had been outlined before the restructuring. But internally, the difference was precise. Every major decision now followed a defined sequence: review, alignment, authorization. Naomi's role did not expand visibly. She did not appear in press releases. She did not attend public events. She did not step into the narrative that Joshua had once controlled. But her presence existed within every outcome, in approvals granted, in risks declined, in adjustments made before instability could surface. Control in her case remained what it had always been: quiet, structural, unavoidable. Joshua remained CEO. The title still appeared beneath his name. The responsibilities remained. The expectations, if anything, had increased. But the nature of his authority had changed. Not removed, refined. He adapted, at first out of necessity, then gradually with understanding. He reviewed decisions more carefully. He questioned assumptions he would have once accepted. He recognized patterns he had previously ignored, not because someone instructed him to, because the structure required it. And within that structure, there was no space for the version of certainty he had once relied on. Margaret visited less often, not out of distance, out of discomfort. The conversations that had once been simple, centered around expectation, projection, control, no longer held. There were questions she did not ask, answers she did not receive, and an absence of influence she did not know how to navigate. Elise adjusted more quickly. She did not confront the shift. She observed it, adapted to it, redirected her attention elsewhere. Because unlike Margaret, she understood something fundamental. Power once redefined does not return to its previous form. Naomi moved to a smaller residence, not out of reduction, out of preference. The new space was efficient, minimal, designed for function rather than display. It reflected her priorities more accurately than the house she had left behind. Her routine remained unchanged. Early mornings, structured work, limited communication. Everything aligned with the same precision that had defined her decisions from the beginning. She did not revisit the past, not because it lacked significance, because it no longer required attention. The finalization of the divorce passed without notice, no announcement, no acknowledgement beyond what the legal system recorded. 2 signatures, a closed file, no further action. Joshua received the final document in his office. He opened it, read it once, then placed it aside. There was no reaction, not because it meant nothing, because it confirmed what had already been understood. Weeks later, he found himself reviewing an early presentation he had given years before. The projections were ambitious, the structure incomplete, the assumptions untested. He recognized it immediately, not as failure, as origin. He saw in that version of himself the same momentum that had carried him forward and the same absence that had required something else to sustain it. Naomi had filled that absence, not visibly, not acknowledged, but completely. He closed the file, not with regret, with clarity, because recognition once established does not require repetition. One evening, after most of the office had emptied, Joshua remained at his desk. The city outside had shifted into quiet motion. Lights steady, movement reduced, contained. He leaned back slightly, his attention unfocused for the first time that day. There was no immediate task, no decision pending, just space. And in that space, the sequence returned. Not as memory, as understanding. The dinner conversations, the assumptions, the moment at the party, the silence that had followed, the document, the call, the meeting. Each step connected, each outcome aligned. Nothing had been sudden, nothing had been arbitrary. It had all followed a structure one he had not seen, because he had not looked. Joshua exhaled slowly, not in frustration, not in regret, but in acceptance. Because the past once understood does not change. It settles. Across the city, Naomi sat by a window in her apartment. The room was quiet, the lights soft, her laptop closed, no documents open, no work pending. For the first time in weeks, there was no immediate sequence to follow. She rested her hands lightly on the table. Not thinking, not planning, just present. The outcome had never been the objective. Alignment had. And alignment had been achieved. Not through confrontation, not through correction, through placement, through timing, through allowing structure to reveal itself when it could no longer be ignored. She stood after a while, walked through the apartment, each space defined, each object intentional, nothing excessive, nothing missing. She picked up her keys, paused briefly, then stepped outside. No hesitation, no reflection, just movement. Joshua did not see her again. There was no final meeting, no closing conversation, no attempt to reconstruct what had already ended. Because what had ended was not a moment. It was a structure. And once a structure collapses, it is not rebuilt. It is replaced. In the months that followed, the story did not circulate publicly. There were no articles, no speculation, no narrative constructed for others to interpret. Because the people who needed to understand already did. And those who did not never would. What remained was not the event, not the conflict, not even the outcome. What remained was the pattern, the difference between perception and reality, between control and assumption, between silence as absence and silence as precision. Naomi had never raised her voice. She had never corrected the narrative while it was still being formed. She had never argued against what others believed. She had simply waited. And when the moment arrived, she placed the truth where it could not be moved. Joshua continued, not as he had been, but as he had become. More measured, more aware, less certain. And in that shift, more aligned with the reality he now understood. Naomi moved forward, without announcement, without explanation, without looking back. Because there was nothing behind her that required it, only what had already been completed, and what remained ahead unburdened by what no longer needed to be carried. The story doesn't end with the moment everyone sees. It ends in the quiet that follows, when truth settles into place, and nothing needs to be said for it to remain. Naomi never demanded recognition. She never defended herself in rooms where her voice would have been dismissed. She didn't interrupt the narrative while it was being built against her. She let it stand. She let it grow. And then, when it could no longer support itself, she revealed what had always been there beneath it. Not to humiliate, not to retaliate, but to correct. There's a difference between silence that hides weakness and silence that prepares clarity. And sometimes the strongest position is the one that never announces itself until it becomes undeniable. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to reflect on where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I read those messages more closely than you might think. And if you believe that dignity, restraint, and truth still matter quietly without performance, then you're already part of what this channel is about. You're welcome to stay.